Good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. We just have a very tense election night behind us. I remember covering two previous presidential elections, and everybody was saying it's the most important election in the history of the US. I think there is more important than the two previous elections. This one there's so much at stake. And one day after election day, we don't know who's going to run the country for the next 4 years. Even though Donald Trump, the current president, stated today that he claimed victory, basically, but with absolutely zero evidence of that. So today, we still have Joe Biden and Donald Trump having a path to victory. It's going to boil down probably to three swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We also have, by the way, apart from the presidential election, a Senate race, which is also very tight, but I guess the dream of the Democratic Party to get again the majority of the Senate is not going to come true because they didn't have a very good battlegrounds. So let me present this panel discussion. I'm very happy to welcome on stage Bernard Harcourt. Bernard Harcourt is the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Valerie Mims, next to me. She's a former US government official. She worked for the State Department under the Clinton administration. Catherine Puga, she's a master's candidate in international relations here at the Graduate Institute. She's from Colorado, a local activist. And David Sylvan is a professor of international relations here at the Graduate Institute. So let me maybe start the conversation. That's a panel discussion that is organized, by the way, by the Graduate Institute in partnership with Le Temps and the Club Diplomatique de Genève. You can watch this panel discussion on the Temps website as well as on the Graduate Institute's website. So maybe to start with, I'd like to have a first reaction to this election night, starting with you, Bernard. What's your first takeaway of this election yesterday? What's your first gut reaction? Bernard, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Stéphane, and it's wonderful to be here with you all, Valérie, Catherine, David. Thanks for coming into the conversation. My first reaction is that white nationalism remains probably one of the strongest forces in American politics. And it's a sad day. It's not new. It's not new that white nationalism is such a strong force in American politics. And of course, it goes back to the history of slavery and takes us to the foundation of this country. But there is something unique feeling about this moment, which is that, in a way, that white nationalism was less present. It was less expressed. It was less vocal. It was less willing to present its face in a way. And that's the thing. What Donald Trump has done, and you have to understand that he is tragically a brilliant politician. What he's done is he's kind of put his finger right on the emotional tap of this feeling, creating this urgency and this need for this nationalism to express itself, to present itself, to reclaim America, to, whether it was remake or keep great, right? It's this idea that somehow they it now needs to express itself in a way that it hasn't for decades. And this is, I mean, I'm generalizing about a huge country. So it's when I say it hasn't presented in this way in decades, of course it does in so many places, so much of the time. But it hasn't presented at this kind of at this national level, at this aggregated national level, in the way that it is now, because this really was a national referendum that we had yesterday. I mean, it can't be understood as anything else than a national referendum on a set of extraordinary policies that Donald Trump enacted during his 4 years. I mean, whether it's the Muslim ban, whether it's kids in cages, whether it's the complete kind of racial discourse, how he's turned anti-racism into a supposedly racist discourse. His attacks on Muslims, on African American leaders, on Hispanics, on immigrants, etc. And his hacking of the Supreme Court. There's no way in which it could not be understood as a referendum, which is why there was such extraordinary turnout on both sides in this country. People understood it as a referendum, and it was a referendum about this kind of isolationist nationalism that Donald Trump really represents. And it's a white nationalism, and it's shocking, frankly. I mean, regardless of who wins this election, it is, to me, shocking that referendum has played out the way it has today.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for this first reaction. Very interesting. Valerie, I guess this notion of white nationalism resonates with you. You're from Michigan. You still have family there. What's your first reaction to what happened last night?
Thank you, Stefan. And I have to say, I'm always thrilled to hear white people talk about white nationalism. It's usually, in the history of America, or at least in modern history from the 60s, you've basically had a coalition of blacks, Jews, progressives who generally came from university, and labor union people. And you can see all of these in the state of Michigan. I went to University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and one of our heroes, there was a lot of study of a man named Walter Reuther, who was at one point called the most dangerous man in America by George Romney, who was the governor of Michigan and happens to be the father of Mitt. Now, a friend of mine recently sent me a Black Lives Matter bag, and I started with a little joke this morning because I was fairly incandescent with rage. And I asked someone, when do Black Lives matter most? And the person said, oh, I don't know. I said, every 4 years when they want black people to save the nation. And black women, in fact, have been the most stalwart guardians of democracy. I think we can say that. And what is not shocking to me, but I'm always unhappy with, is I remember the marches with all the women with the pink hats. But when we look at the statistics, and the Republicans know what they're doing, they have been recruiting women to run for office. And they have also been recruiting black men. And the black men often have a certain profile. Either the profile is military or athletic, business. And so there is a plan, and I think this, while it can't be a second Reconstruction, I think it's certainly a continuation of the Civil War. And it was Martin Luther King himself. You know, people think of him as a pacifist all the time, but in fact, King, before he died, talked about the three evils in America. And one of them, racism, poverty, the other one doesn't exactly come to mind, but in that speech, he talked about white backlash. And Donald Trump is the essence of white backlash. You have someone who is completely unqualified for office. If you look at the number of military, ex-military staff he had in his first cabinet, and they all left. All of the people that have left the administration, the scandals, this can only be explained for me by cult of personality and white nationalism. One last thing I want to say. The Latino Hispanic community is very complex. You have Cubans from Florida, you have Chicanos, you have people in Mexican, but sometimes the trends show the further away from immigration the families are, the more they may identify with the Republican Party. And what that means essentially is, I would say, a way of becoming white. We've seen this with Irish immigrants, we've seen this with Italian immigrants, we've seen this with Polish immigrants. My one ray of sunshine, I would say, that you're getting a more progressive wing of the party. This started last time with AOC and her squad and others. We had two openly gay black men be elected to the Congress. So I think you're no longer going to have these districts that are formerly represented by, let's say, ethnic Irish or others that are majority minority districts. You're going to have more push from the progressives.
I think thank you so much, Valerie. I think it's very interesting what you're underlying, the demographics of the candidate, because it's not as simple as we thought it was. We saw that in Florida, for example, in Miami-Dade County, where actually Joe Biden did badly, in the sense it was worse than what Hillary Clinton was able to achieve there, because a lot of Hispanic voters basically voted for Donald Trump. Catherine, you're a student, you're 25-year-old. I was wondering, how do you perceive what happened last night and what's going to happen in the coming days? Because it's not election day, it's an electoral process, obviously. Hoping that we're going to get to know the new president in the coming days before the end of the week. So Catherine, what's your gut feeling about what happened last night?
So, again, thank you for having me here. My first reaction is that I really wanted to be surprised. I wanted a really aggressive blue wave. I wanted strong turnout for Joe Biden in all of these swing states. And instead, what we're seeing is that this is going to play out over the course of the week, literally on knife's edge in Wisconsin and Michigan, which is perhaps not that surprising, but you want it so badly, and it doesn't happen. And then obviously the Trump administration has already filed suit in Pennsylvania. They're going to continue to file suit in all of these swing states, and he's been laying the groundwork for this since February, talking about mail fraud and absentee ballots aren't real voters, and you have to stop the count on election day, which is just absurdity. Because he truly knows that the only path to victory that they have is through voter suppression and widespread voter suppression. From Florida, where you had essentially 700,000 people who were supposed to be enfranchised, but who were disenfranchised, convicted felons who were not able to pay fines associated with their sentencing, from areas in Texas and areas in Florida and Wisconsin where ballot boxes were taken away and deadlines were changed. And I've been doing volunteering, phone banking and text banking, mostly North Carolina. And a lot of what you were trying to push in the last few days was, please take your ballot to the drop-off box. Please do not mail it, because the amount of doubt that he has created around the election result is going to be extremely damaging, regardless of the final electoral count and recounts and judicial processes.
Thank you so much, Catherine. David, I talked to you a bit before the election day, and you sounded a little bit optimistic about what was going to come. Today, what's your general feeling? Even though Joe Biden still have obviously a path to victory, but what's your feeling? What's your reaction to what happened?
Well, thank you. I actually have lots of conflicting views on this, but I guess I would say, first of all, I do think that currently that the tea leaves are looking a little bit better for Biden at this point. If if you had to bet, you would probably say that the odds are better for him at this point than Trump in terms of the remaining votes still outstanding and the likelihood of winning certain states and so forth. I guess I would make two observations, and it's not that necessarily that I disagree with what Bernard said at the beginning about white nationalism, but it seems to me that there's actually two simultaneous processes going on in terms of what this election seems to me revealed. One is that a core component of the Republican Party is in the process of actually being detached from the Republican Party. So that on the one hand, there is absolutely a strong white nationalist element, which, by the way, is no longer just white. There's evidence, for example, that some African-American males were supporting Trump. There's evidence from Miami-Dade that was already alluded to before that this is also the case for certain Latino males and so forth. There's a strong kind of affective, emotion-driven, viscera-driven politics that is what I would call the politics of affect here, and it's very, very strong, and it's very much similar to what one finds in a lot of European states as well. And for that matter, if you think of people like Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so forth, this is a generalized phenomenon. But in any case, Trump was able to hold on to those people. On the other hand, what he lost in a very significant way, state after state after state, is people in what in the United States has a different meaning in Europe, of course. In the United States, it's called the suburbs, which is to say relatively well-off people who are primarily, or by no means exclusively, white, and in particular in that category, women disproportionately so. We already saw this in 2018. The so-called gender gap has been noted, but in 2018 you had formerly red suburbs peeling away, and the peeling has continued at this point. And this was a core component of Republican presidential coalitions going back for years and years and years. The fact that this happened across the board in state after state after state, including in southern states, in border states, and so forth, it seems to me significant. That suggests that the future of the Republican Party is likely, in spite of the people in the Lincoln Project and so forth, to be much more centered exactly around this kind of hate-driven politics. Now, on the other hand, what one also sees, analogously in the case of the Democratic Party, is that a key component of its coalition is beginning to fray around the edges. We already saw this in 2016 with Hillary, and the fact that she was not able to mobilize, for example, African-American voters nearly as much as Obama had done. Now, people said at the time that's an unfair comparison, and it is an unfair comparison, okay? There's no possible way she could have done this, but the assumption was that in this election people would drift back, especially given the high levels of antipathy in the African-American communities, or communities plural, I should say, to Trump. That didn't happen as much, and one of the reasons that the polls were so badly off in a number of states is that even if this time they got right the turnout rate for the white, non-college educated males, because the generals fighting the last war, they don't make the same mistake exactly 2 times in a row. They were still wrong with regard to the turnout rate for African American males especially, and to some degree with Latinos. And I would just say parenthetically, this phenomenon of immigrants becoming more and more conservative and voting on the right is a very well-studied phenomenon that exists around the world. But in any case, that's just to say that the old power brokers, if people think of people like Jim Clyburn and so forth in South Carolina, it's not doing the job as much. So we have simultaneously the Republican Party losing a really important component of its winning coalitions for decades, and we have the Democratic Party gradually seeing an erosion of a comparable part of its coalition. It's not the same thing, and I'm not saying morally that are all on the same kind of plane, but in both cases what you have, it seems to me, is the beginning at the national level of a kind of complete recomposition of the kind of party landscape and so forth. One can interpret this as very, very hopeful in the sense that a lot more things are up for grabs now than in the future in terms of what's happening, for example, in the Democratic Party. Okay, But one can also see this as the equivalent of a kind of time of troubles, in which what we actually have is people being detached from traditional kind of party structures and indeed from civil society in a much more general sense. And that's the kind of thing that actually worries me greatly. It strikes me simply that the combination of violence and of threats of violence and of, as it were, acting out displays of at least pseudo-violence on the one hand, and on the other hand, in the case of the Democrats, of increasing apathy for people who, on principle, should be voting for them. That's a really toxic combination. Violence and apathy does not lead to a healthy democratic republic.
Thank you so much, David. That's a theme that we're going to discuss during this conversation, because we entitled actually this panel discussion "A New Age of Reconstruction." Obviously, referring, as Valerie was saying, to the era of Reconstruction in the 19th century. Obviously, we're not now in a civil war, but threats of violence are blatant. Obviously, now we're going to see what's going to happen in the coming days. Bernard, I would like to have your take on the following. We're talking, when we're talking about the U.S. today and about the very intense battle that we saw during the whole campaign and yesterday and it has been going on for months, we're talking about a culture war. What would you say about that? Are we experiencing now a real culture war, and what kind of manifestation does it have?
Right, thanks, Stefan. You know, we've been in a cultural war in this country for several decades, at least, and in the sense that as we tend to define cultural wars in this country, being questions of abortion and reproduction and choice, questions of carrying firearms and the NRA. So we have certain categories that, and we've been in a cultural war for several decades. I think, you know, Justice Scalia had his finger really on that cultural war, and he played to it often. I would say that we are getting beyond the paradigm of cultural wars somehow. That it's more than simply cultural war. Now, what could it then be? I think that's the real puzzle right now. It's clearly we're not in civil war, and the term civil war as a literal term is too exaggerated at this moment to explain what's going on in this country. But I think that the metaphor of civil war is far closer to what we're in right now as a beyond culture wars. And my sense is that is a product, again, of the way in which Trump has been able to tap into the emotional kind of just the emotional spinal cord, nerve of his base. And so when I think that when you see the kind of way in which the Trump supporters are manifesting their support for Trump, which is predominantly through these convoys of trucks. Well, you know, it's an American car, you know, the Humvee or a pickup or whatever, 4x4s, but these are functionally trucks by European standards. The trucks laden with these American flags flying all over, driving in convoys. The metaphor is something about a civil war going on rather than just a cultural war. Also, the preponderance and the increased use of the thin blue line flag which I don't know if you've been following that abroad, but basically there's a new, it's not a new flag, but its visibility has become new. It's an American flag that is black and white instead of red, white, and blue. So it's a black and white flag, and then right through the middle of it, there's a thin blue line, which has been associated, of course, the thin blue line is associated with the police. It has always been, for many decades now, we talk about the thin blue line as the police that maintains order, allegedly. With the 1,000 plus police killings every year, it also maintains racial hierarchy in this country, but I'll put that aside. But the flag itself, which began to be seen at, for instance, at Charlottesville during the fascist neo-Nazi protests there, and it's begun to be seen more and more, actually was flying behind Trump at recently, like 2 days ago, at a rally. And in other words, he was speaking in front of a row of these blue flags. Now, I mean, black and white and blue flag. You have to understand that is actually pushing the country metaphorically, visually, in terms of its symbols, towards something that is more than just a cultural war. That would be the point I would make. And I don't think that it's easy to put your finger exactly on what it is yet, but I do believe that the metaphor of civil war, not literally, but the metaphor is much more accurate.
I think, Bernard, you already had a sense of the potential of violence in the US society. You've wrote a book called The Counter-Revolution, How the Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens. What was your take in this book, and how do you relate it to what's going on now here?
Yeah, well, thanks, Stefan, for mentioning that, because it feels like so far in the past. But that book was actually trying to trace the way in which we in the United States govern others and ourselves through a counterinsurgency warfare paradigm of governing, and that we've been doing that since 9/11. And so what I argue in the book is that since 9/11, we have turned more and more towards strategies, first militarily, that's well known and well accepted. We moved to counterinsurgency warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's well recognized. General David Petraeus, published the new U.S. Armed Force Manual for Counterinsurgency in 2006, distributed to everyone, and it was clear that we were fighting a war using the tools of counterinsurgency warfare, which were developed by the French, the British, the Americans in Indochina, Algeria, Vietnam, etc. It's clear that we were doing that militarily. My argument is that since 9/11, that mindset, that logic of counterinsurgency warfare has taken over foreign policy, such that we started to use, for instance, drone strikes in non-war zones, right? Or we started to use global surveillance, global NSA surveillance to acquire all information, which is a classic counterinsurgency strategy. And that ultimately that came home to roost. And so when we see the hyper-militarized police forces in the United States, which are funded through DoD programs like the 1033, where they're able to bring all the excess military equipment, counterinsurgency military equipment back to the United States. You see hyper-militarized policing, beginning uses of drone, a different kind of mentality in policing, a much more militarized mentality, et cetera. I argue that we have internalized the counterinsurgency paradigm in this country. Now, that was written before the 2016 election. And so it wasn't a claim about Trump, it was a claim actually about the various administrations since 9/11, including, sadly, the Obama administration, which deployed many of these strategies. Drone strikes, for instance, rocketed with Obama in 2008. And in fact, it was Obama who, had his legal counsel, David Barron, write the 41-page memo that allowed the summary execution of an American abroad. So I was suggesting that there was continuity, it takes different forms, but there was continuity. It was written before Trump. What's clear to me is that Trump has continued in this vein. All of his policies have been in that vein, creating an internal enemy exactly in the way in which we do in counterinsurgency theory, creating an internal enemy, mostly beginning with Muslims, mostly Muslim ban, which is the first thing it did. But that it has taken a white nationalist turn with Trump. So the logic continues. It's varied over different administrations, but now it's in a more white nationalist manifestation of that kind of counterinsurgency paradigm of governing.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Valerie, Michigan is a battleground, very important. It might decide on who's going to be the next president for the next 4 years. You're from Michigan. There's been an attempt at kidnapping the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, because white supremacists or whatever, we were rebelling against lockdowns and mask wearing and things like that. So I was wondering, there's a book called What's the Matter with Kansas? I'm asking you, what's the matter with Michigan?
Well, that takes about a week to explain. Let me just mention that there's an interstate, Interstate 75, that runs from Florida all the way up to Michigan. And this is one of the paths not only for the internal great migration of black people, but also white people from the South. Many people were going up to work in the auto industry. And there you had the great labor movements. In the 80s, when Reagan came along, there was something that was identified as the Macomb County Democrat, as there was restructuring and the auto industries were starting to move down south and to Mexico and other places. You had the fall of that industry, and auto industry jobs were jobs that people, whites and blacks, could have without a college education. You worked on the line or you worked in the factories. You had excellent health care. You had a car subsidized, a new car every couple of years. It was a good life. Some people had a little cottage on the lake. So everything was, as we can say, hunky-dory for a while. But with the transformation of that loss of manufacturing, and I think you can make similar comparisons about the state of Pennsylvania and the steel industry. Ohio, the loss of tire manufacturers. So everywhere where you were losing manufacturing, this is where I think you get the point of Professor Sylvan about the affect. Because where do those people go who don't have a college education, especially with the price of college education being outreach for many people? And what happens is those people, a bit like the rise of National Socialism in another country, are left without jobs. They are competing against young people for jobs at McDonald's or in the service industry. And so there you have a population ripe for Trump. Now, one aspect I think we need to talk about Trump is the toxic masculinity. He often attacks women. And I think this toxic masculinity also plays into certain elements in the black community. That is, with the rise of black women in politics, for example, the prominence of people like Maxine Waters and so on. James Clyburn is a different kind of politician. He's not as vocal, and that comes from his background in the South. My father was from Georgia, and you have a certain way that black men of that era deal with white men. There's not direct confrontation. They're very, very aware of this issue because in the South, in the past, if a white man was coming down the street, the black man had to move. So Southern black politicians, I think, are more aware of this kind of ethic. But I think it's no accident that Trump was appealing to certain rappers who, in their language, in hip-hop and so on, you hear that toxic masculinity. And I think that appeals to the affect issue that Professor Sylvan was talking about. Now, going back to Michigan, in the 70s, we had the whole question of busing, which Biden also was caught up in. We had bombings of buses in Michigan. Timothy McVeigh, who was responsible for the Oklahoma bombings, from Michigan. So you have that whole population of people. Detroit is very prominent, Flint is very prominent, but those are pockets of black community. You also now have a very large Muslim community just outside of Detroit in Dearborn. Sorry, I just want to go back to the issue of apathy. I wouldn't describe it as apathy so much as the massive voter suppression that we often don't really talk about, the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Republicans poured into that, to the extent that we really can't say that the United States is a democracy. Because when people have to wait hours in line to vote, when their votes are challenged, signatures and so on, it's more sophisticated than in the Deep South in the past, where they would ask them, to recite the Constitution or how many jelly beans were in this jar, and so on. But when people, during a time of COVID, or if you have an hourly wage job where you can't take off time, so people try to go at 7 in the morning to, meet their shift. And so I think Michigan is a typical state where if you don't have a Democratic governor, it's very likely to go Republican. I also would just say that it's not an accident the Republicans had John James, a very, smart-looking black guy who's an entrepreneur, he's former military, because they want to split the ticket. They want to drive that, and that's the profile of the black man, sort of hyper-masculine. On the other hand, you have these militias that invaded the state capitol with guns, massive guns. Most of these guys are not veterans. Final point I want to make, the difference between the military and the police. And I started hearing this term inflection point. I think Larry Summers and others was happening over the summer, primarily academics, some people in the military. And I started thinking about it, and I think we were at a very dangerous point this summer when Trump was at Lafayette Square with the Bible and so on. And I think that's when you had a number of ex-military coming out saying, no, we will support the Constitution, and so on and so forth. You had the Master Sergeant of the Air Force, who is black. You had other generals, ex-generals coming out. And I think that was extremely important for the military to do that, because in Washington, D.C., you had police forces without insignias. It turns out they came from the Bureau of Prisons, and that's going to happen again. It's very rare to see that on the streets of America. And in fact, I think professors, correct me if I'm wrong, the doctrine of posse comitatus says you cannot have military on the streets. So we have the levels of police, we have the levels of National Guard, and then all of a sudden, bureaus of prison, park service, all of these different police forces. So I think this fomenting of violence, this saying there's fraud, is another incitement to violence. And again, it's the toxic masculinity that goes with the Proud Boys, that goes with all of these militias across America.
Thank you, Valerie. Just a question about Joe Biden and Michigan. Joe Biden grew up in a working class environment, and he was very much in touch with this kind of electorate. And so I'm wondering, why wasn't he able to carry Michigan hands down, to appeal to this working class electorate, which has been suffering from automation, from job losses and things like that? How do you explain that?
Well, I think, and again, professors correct me if I'm wrong, no one in the industrialized world has a plan for what to do for people who were in manufacturing. What is the next stage? Is it Uber? Just gig economy? There was a vote on that in California for what kind of, are people employees or are they contractors? So we don't know what kind of jobs people who are not college educated and even people who have a bachelor's degree can do and support their families. And that is people are extremely worried. You had Trump people talking about how great the economy was and so on. And part of that was just puffed up because of the stock market and so on. those other people didn't have jobs. You know, because the jobs that were in Michigan were not only connected to the auto industry, but you had all of these ancillary jobs, the tool and die jobs and so on, little shops, garages and so on, that people made a decent living. And I think that that is one of the major problems, is that in the industrialized world, no one knows where those next good jobs are going to come from, because these are not dot-com millionaires who are going to be able to enter the labor force.
Thank you, Valerie. Catherine, you grew up in Denver, Colorado. You're still an activist there. And I remember talking with you some days ago, and you were basically saying that it's sometimes difficult to have trust in what's going on in Washington, in federal politics and things like that. And I'm wondering, you were basically saying that local activism is something that might, I wouldn't say save the country, but it might bring the country a bit forward. What could you say about your local activism and the importance of that?
Sure. I think it's a little bit generous to call me a local activist. I'm someone who tries to stay involved and be involved and learn a lot more as I get older and have more experience. I was not able to vote in the 2012 presidential election, but I was able to volunteer. That was my kind of first experience volunteering, and then in various local elections, and then 2016 was my first year that I was able to vote in a presidential election. Not the outcome that I was hoping for. And I think, you know, to disagree a little bit with something that Professor Sullivan said, I think there's a difference between apathy and cynicism in my generation. It's not the idea that I don't care, that people don't, on the fringes of the Democratic Party don't care about politics. It's more the idea of questioning what can actually be accomplished at the federal level. I think about, okay, Joe Biden gets the presidency and he's inaugurated in January. It's not as though Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is gonna wake up on January 22nd and be like, okay, the American people have spoken. I'm gonna let things go through the Senate. And then on the off chance that Biden's able to push any kind of major legislation through what looks like going to be a very divided Senate, the likelihood that that goes through any kind of judicial appeal and passes through any kind of judicial appeal, I think about the Affordable Care Act and the fact that it was gutted by the Supreme Court. And a lot of the parts of the Affordable Care Act that I care about, so if I go back to the US this summer, I turn 26 in June, I will be uninsured. So I have to figure that out with my parents. And so looking more towards, okay, where can I actually make a difference? Where can I make an impact? I was very proud that in Colorado this summer, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests and the murder of George Floyd, Colorado was one of the only states and the first state to pass any kind of substantive legislation regarding changing how Colorado uses the police force. So Colorado ended qualified immunity and started to consider diverting a lot of funds away from the police force into things like mental health, advocacy and training and response groups. So that was really exciting. And also looking, Colorado voters just rejected a proposition to ban abortions after a certain period of weeks. Like, these are things that happen that matter, and they happen much more for me at a local level. And that's where I'm seeing a lot of change and progress in laws that I actually care about and that impact my generation much more. And that's definitely something that I've learned a lot more about as I've gotten older, is the impact that things like even like my city council can have on, for example, public education in my state, or on affordable housing, which is a huge issue in Colorado right now. So that's something that I'm definitely, I think, looking a little bit more towards. And I mean, I obviously hope Joe Biden wins and becomes the president in January, but if you're asking if I'm optimistic about his 4 years in office, not particularly.
I have another question for you, Catherine. When we talk about the US, we talk about Trump's America. Sometimes I have the impression that the real America, or I would say tomorrow's America, is different, in the sense that, and I'm thinking about the younger generation and thinking, for example, of the movement Black Lives Matter, which is you have a mix of very different people. It's a diversity of the U.S. that is expressed in this movement. And I was wondering, coming from a member of the younger generation, for you, what's today's America and tomorrow's America? Do you see it differently? Do you think that you'll be able to move beyond what's going on now with the Trump administration?
I mean, I certainly hope so. I think it's a pretty well-established trend that when you are younger, you tend to vote more left, and then as you age, that changes a little bit. So maybe that will, my generation right now, I think, overwhelmingly agrees with, considers themselves aligned with the Democratic Party, but that changes. I think certainly it's very exciting to see, you know, the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement are largely younger people who are pushing for and fighting for change in their community, which is fantastic. I think this idea that we have to sit and wait back for demographic changes to happen. Like it's, okay, we just have to sit and wait, and Texas is gonna eventually flip blue because it's a younger population, it's an increasingly diverse population, we just have to sit back and wait. Or with Georgia, we just have to sit back and wait and demographic change is gonna happen and usher in change. That largely doesn't happen. And I think it's more, what can particularly the Democratic Party do to nominate people, to push forward people, to elevate voices, to actually bring people into this fold, instead of just saying, okay, we're gonna wait and see as the young people get older and are able to vote, because I don't think that's necessarily a very effective strategy.
Thank you so much, Catherine. David, I would like to take a step back from domestic politics and thinking, what would be your take on depending on who's going to sit in the Oval Office in the next 4 years? How do you see Biden's administration in terms of foreign policy toward China, for example, towards the European Union? Will he be able to reestablish some kind of transatlantic bond, which has been very, very savagely damaged by the Trump administration? How do you see a Biden administration? And if Trump is reelected, how do you see the next 4 years in terms of US foreign policy? Thank you.
I'm not sure I have an answer to the second half of the question, if Trump were reelected, about what would happen, because it's like that line of Joyce, it's history is a nightmare from which we can't wake up. And I think that's probably what would be the case. Let me try to answer your question, but also refer to one or two other things that have been said. I think that if you look at the people who surround Biden, I mean, Biden is, to use the French expression, is a vieux routier de la politique. He's been around forever. He's been in the Senate, I think, since the 1970s, or he was in the Senate since the 1970s. And he was at a certain point, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he was, under Obama, sent as the point man to do all kinds of missions and so on and so forth. He's as establishment, to use an old-fashioned term, as they come. And certainly there's a whole bunch of people who are kind of like courtiers in waiting. They're hanging around places like Brookings or certain kind of Democratic Party sinecures and things like different staff positions in the House of Representatives or on the minority side in the Senate, or some of the kind of other think tanks and things like that. And so there will be absolute and complete continuity. Already when Obama came in, as was pointed out before, you know, he wasn't exactly a barn burner when it came to foreign policy. He actually had an enormous amount of continuity. And I think everything is encapsulated in either the way that he basically, for example, when there was the coup d'etat in Honduras, gave them a pass, or his embarrassment about, not just embarrassment at being given the Nobel Peace Prize, but his actual defense of violence in the Nobel Peace Prize speech, which is quite extraordinary if you think about it. So I think that there's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that if Biden comes in, he will attempt to restore the status quo ante. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'm sure he will immediately rescind U.S. withdrawal from the WHO. He will fulsomely participate in things like NATO. He will try as much as he can to up contributions of the U.S. budgetarily to different IOs. He will try to revive certain kinds of alliances and discussions and so forth. He will clearly try to negotiate an end to the various trade wars that Trump has gone on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think, I mean, this to me is absolutely the case. And if you look at the people who's followed him, if you look at his reasoning and so on and so forth. But that said, it seems to me that that's actually part of the problem, and that's what I was trying to get at before when I was indicating that I thought that the Democratic Party, just like the Republican Party, is in the process of disintegrating. In the Democrats, you see not just component parts of their as it were racial coalition deserting them. And I think I would still call it apathy, because cynicism implies that people are actually paying attention to the details. And I think that a lot of the people who have checked out have checked out. They're not paying attention to the details, but maybe we can argue about the semantics of that later. But it's not just that parts of it, of each coalition are disintegrating, but that indeed at the level of intellectuals, the range of alternatives is much greater than before. It seems to me that the ground is moving under Biden's feet, and I don't think he's aware of that. He's dimly aware of it. I'll take that back. He's dimly aware of it. You saw that in terms of what he said about everything from Medicare for all to the so-called Green New Deal to the things about fracking and so forth. I mean, he reminds me exactly of someone like Franklin Roosevelt, although obviously without the same political skills. Who has perhaps a first-class temperament, and certainly can be pushed and will be pushed to the left, I think, by a lot of his base there. But the point I'm trying to get at is that the Democratic Party is also in the process of peeling off swaths of itself on foreign policy issues. You see this on economic policy issues, on foreign policy issues. So it's not just a question that assembling a coalition to win elections, that some of the usual parts are not there anymore. They're reaching for, I don't know, whatever, and they can't find the tool. But they're also that things are actually starting to fall apart in another way. And this will be a real flashpoint on issues, for example, connected with trade. For example, Biden is a loyal foot soldier of the Democratic Party. The elites in the Democrats basically have been marching in lockstep with the Republicans on one of the issues you mentioned, which is the demonization of China. And by the way, their counterparts in elites in Europe and in Oceania and in Asia are doing the same kind of thing. We are clearly heading for a really prolonged period of high tension with China for many, many years, and quasi-militarized tension, because Republicans and Democrats actually agree on this. So I guess the point I would get at is that what we have is a kind of return to the past, in a sense. And you can't recreate the past. And it seems to me that part of the real issue, therefore, is how the incredible enthusiasm that one saw manifested in the BLM movements around the world, by the way, not just in the United States, back in the spring and early part of the summer, how that can actually be captured and actually bottled and as it were, used to kind of reinfuse politics. Put it this way: in political science, the standard definition of a political party is it's a mechanism for aggregating interests. It takes the interest of this group here and that group here and that group here and packages it together in the form of a manifesto, or in US terms, a platform, and says, okay, vote for us and you'll all get a piece of the pie. And that's what parties do all over the world. And that works in an era where the different interests are, as it were, mutually compatible. Already we can see that that's no longer the case. And you can see this in the Republicans. I mean, they had a really good ride for quite a long while, maintaining things like tax cuts and opposition to abortion, bringing together Wall Streeters and evangelicals. I mean, that was quite a feat if you think about it. The Democrats, if you go back to the New Deal, okay, and then the version of it in the Great Society, did something analogous. It's obviously completely different components. I don't think that those recipes work anymore, and I think that this election actually shows this. So, you know, to play the full intellectual, I would say that what we have now, in quoting Gramsci, is a period of morbid tendencies.
You were talking about China. Joe Biden has been very tough on China as well during the campaign, and obviously the Democrats are it's also a stance that they're going to take. But do you see some kind of future cooperation? Under the Obama administration, there was a sense that you cannot not cooperate with China. That's what happened with the Paris Accord. A year before the Paris conference, Obama reached out to Xi Jinping, and they changed the whole dynamics of the Paris conference. Do you see that happening with Joe Biden, even though he has taken a very tough stance on China?
I am sure there will be some specific agreements. As I said, I expect him to try to end the trade war with China because it's not benefiting either country. And I expect that he will try to play into the Chinese sense of kind of being flattered about and being a leader on environmental issues now, to try to revive some of the kinds of climate change types of agreements that you had before. And I'm sure there will be issues worked out on a kind of case-by-case basis. I have no doubt about that. But it strikes me that one of the things that really has happened, and this well transcends Trump, it's a general phenomenon, is that there's a very, very significant kind of disaffection at this point with China and on the part of elites all over the world. And my guess is that the irony is that what's going on is that's gradually being overlaid. It was crisscrossing, and now it's being overlaying, if you think about cleavages, overlaid onto issues about white nationalism and about xenophobia and so forth. So that just the way that Putin already became the kind of poster boy, you know, for a whole European version of kind of xenophobic, militarized nationalism, I think that Xi is going to become, in a somewhat similar fashion, people at least who are rejecting kind of classical liberalism. And so I think that what we're faced with, ironically, even as democracy is kind of frittering away around the edges, in certain respects, is that you see an increased push by elites to actually have this particular discourse of democracy much, much stronger than before. And I think that that's going to be the particular stick that they're going to try to beat the Chinese with.
Thank you, David. Before we take some questions, I'm going to have a last question for Bernard. Valerie was talking about the flaws of the U.S. democracy in terms of voting rights, for example, and things like that. I'm wondering, is the U.S. to be saved in terms of social contract? Do we need a new social contract in America, and what kind of form would it take if that's possible?
Yeah. I do feel that the notion of the social contract isn't performing, isn't that we're in need of some kind of recontracting. Of course, American history is not exactly the perfect illustration of a universal social contract, since it was built on slavery and the exclusion of women, voters, etc. So the social contract analogy and that metaphor and that entire way of thinking about democratic relations is itself somewhat fraught. But were one to want to continue in the vein of speaking about social contract, maybe in the sense of kind of a more civil political space, it's clear that one of the main places where there needs to be not just reform, but transformation in this country has to do with those issues of felon disenfranchisement, which are related to issues of mass incarceration in this country. Numbers that we tend to forget, but that are so extraordinary and exceptional in the world that we need to be reminded. You know, more than 2.2 million people behind bars in this country right now as I speak. Right, that's about 50% of the population of Denmark. Okay, half of the population of Denmark in the United States is behind bars, right? And we talk a lot about criminal justice reform, but even we're beyond that right now. I mean, the kind of reforms that we saw for policing, for instance, produced nothing. We saw it in Minnesota with the George Floyd killing, right? A police force that had gone through all of the kind of sensitivity, anti-racism training, et cetera, that could just, you know, kill George Floyd like that in front of cameras. So, so we're a little bit beyond these reforms, and I do think that in terms of rethinking about a social contract, we need to transform so many of these areas that are criminal justice related. And the model I'm thinking about right now is not reform, but actually W.E.B. Du Bois's model of what he called abolition democracy. In his magnum opus, actually, Black Reconstruction in America, which fits perfectly with the title and the topic and the ideas of this panel, right? I mean, Du Bois's idea about abolition democracy was that you can't achieve abolition simply negatively by abolishing slavery. And what needed to be done were a whole set of institutions and policies and programs to incorporate former slaves who were now free Black women and men. And that never happened. With the ending of Reconstruction in 1876 and the compromise that led to Hayes's presidency, there never really was that kind of transformative abolition democracy. That's the model actually that I think about today and I'm studying and thinking about, because it is a fundamental transformation of America that is necessary, and not simply by eliminating, say, mass incarceration, but by building something new in its stead.
Thank you, Bernard. I think, Valerie, you just want to react to this?
Not that, but I just want to go back to something that I thought was fascinating that Professor Sylvan said in terms of foreign policy. I think, I don't know if it was Mark Twain or who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think we could, in some ways, look at this period as the period before World War I, with this extremely multipolar. Look at what's happening in Turkey, Brexit, France, Austria with the recent attacks. I think it's a very, very dangerous period. The other thing I wanted to say, in terms of Congress, the Foreign Relations Committee used to be a power in the land. The hearings under Kerry and others were extremely important, even under Biden. That has disappeared. The position of Secretary of State has essentially disappeared. Tillerson, who called Trump, bored and other names, but Pompeo you don't hear much about. So, in fact, I think over this time, the institution of Congress has virtually disappeared. So you had three people, Pelosi, McConnell, and Trump. And you didn't hear any more about the National Security Council, except the people who were being circulated through and fired and so on. You know, in the beginning, you had these ex-generals. So what's happened is, and part of this is purposeful, the destruction or the elimination of American institutions that were, I would say, balance of powers, but in some respects kept each other in check. The other thing is this gerontocracy, and I think it's wonderful that younger people have come along, because it is a problem in the Congressional Black Caucus where you have people who are older, and the younger generation just doesn't want that anymore, because they do know, they perceive that the lobbyists in Washington have a lot of influence with these members of Congress. And the younger generations, the AOCs and so on, are saying to Pelosi, no, we have our own terms in which we're going to do it. And some of the younger black members are doing it too. So these institutions like the Congressional Black Caucus and so on, they're perceived as dinosaurs to younger generation. And that's where the fraying, I think, is coming. Last thing, Elizabeth Warren wants to be, for example, Secretary of the Treasury. And, you know, that's a no-go. I'm wondering where Bernie Sanders was these last couple of weeks. You didn't see him out very much, you know, and I think for me, you know, this is another part of the party. I was never a Sanders person, but I will say that this kind of wing, already people are talking about, oh, Elizabeth Warren should get that position and so on. I think probably Buttigieg is maybe better suited temperamentally, but that would be a continuation of the elites. But to me, it's been astonishing, the disappearance of certain American institutions.
I think, yeah, thank you, Valerie. Yeah, check and balances, which had a very strong reputation as a word, are effectively weakened. Lena, could we move to questions? Could you ask the first questions?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions from the audience attending us online. Maybe before I share the questions with you and the panel, I just wanted to remind the audience that is following us online that they can ask questions in the Q&A section, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So the first questions we have is specifically addressed to Professor Sylvan and Professor Harcourt on the US-China relations. Given that we are going to witness a high tension between the US and China in the next years, what do you think the two countries can do to deal with that tension? And if possible, to bring US-China relations back to a kind of normal track?
Who wants to respond? Bernard or David?
David.
David.
Thank you. I'm not sure it can be put back together easily, to be honest with you. It strikes me that, in a sense, that both China and Russia, in obviously very different ways, were both, to use a deliberately provocative term, we're kind of on probation from the standpoint of Western elites in terms of integration into what they considered their global economy and their multilateral system. I think it's very clear that that Putin was, and Russia more generally, was kind of put in the corner, to continue the metaphor, and was really, at this point, I mean, the expulsion from what had been the G7, I think, was actually very, very significant. And it seems to me that the same thing is happening right now with regard to China. As I said earlier in answer to one of the questions that Stefan asked, I think it's absolutely possible, and indeed there will be issue-by-issue agreements. But it strikes me that this is not something that's going to happen very much, and indeed, in terms of a kind of a broader reset, from the standpoint of elites in the United States and in East Asia, in Europe, there is no compromise that's possible with a country that, as they see it, is ruled by a single-party state, which actually has increasing Maoist tendencies. They do not consider that as a viable option, even for investment, because they don't believe anymore there's anything resembling the rule of law. They don't believe that investments can actually be protected, that contracts can actually be honored, and they see this as something that is completely antipathetic to them. So in that sense, it seems to me that that's one of the few issues on which U.S. elites actually agree right now. They disagree on all kinds of other issues, from health insurance to the economy and so forth. But on this one, they're absolutely in lockstep. As this is, if you will, is kind of the last hurrah of the Cold War.
I would hesitate to jump into waters and David is far more of an expert in this area in international relations than I am. So I would just and I agree entirely with what he's said and discussed about China. You know, the only thing I would say, and this isn't different, though, is that until the United States political leadership understands or fully starts dealing with or understanding and shifting its mentality in response to the fact that China is becoming much more of an international player than the United States, we're headed down a very dangerous path in this country in terms of our politics, I would say. Because if Americans don't understand the role that China is playing, say, in Africa and in other parts of the world that we have in some sense completely retreated from, particularly in the past 4 years, obviously, but because of the form of isolationism, I think the United States is on a dangerous path internationally.
Lena, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. We have one coming back to the discussion you had at the beginning of the panel, which is more about the risk posed by militias. This person is asking, is it a matter of visibility and affirmation of a position, or is it there a genuine risk of tipping into organized violence?
Valerie, do you want to answer this?
Let me just first say, I think from what I've read, there is no real definition in the law of domestic terrorism, because terrorism is used as a term for foreign actors against the state. So that being said, I believe the FBI has classified militias and those threats, white supremacist threats, as the #1 domestic terrorist issue. So we know they are organized. Fortunately, the men who were involved in the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer were, bumbling. But there are significant elements in the police and the U.S. military of white supremacists. You see this in Germany as well, far right. On the other hand, I will say that since Crispus Attucks in the Revolutionary War, blacks have a long tradition of serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. And I think it's, as my friend from Queens would say, it's not for nothing that the military came out and made these statements, because you have a significant, this percentage of blacks, which I think is like 13% in the armed forces. And we're talking about generations of people, Vietnam War generation, Gulf War generation. And I think this younger generation is not willing to be so much like the Dr. Martin Luther Kings. They are ready to be armed. And this is happening on the left as well. I don't think that there's going to be this kind of we shall overcome. And white women too. I saw an article, I don't know where it was, I think it was in the Washington Post, about people on the left now getting guns and going to shooting ranges and so on. So, and let me just say, my family, my dad was from Georgia. We all grew up with guns. All of my brothers know about guns. So I don't think you can have this idea that the white militia are going to, if something, as they say in the UK, kicks off, that everything is going to be, people are going to let themselves be shot. But the elements in the police and some in the military, this is a very, very important point, and it needs to be addressed. I think the Army is doing some things to address that, but the police are a whole nother matter.
Yeah, thank you, Valerie. And it raises a question, by the way, of the excesses of the First and Second Amendment, in the sense of freedom of speech, but to such an extent that sometimes it incites to hatred, and the culture of the Second Amendment is also a problem with it. Altogether, that's a very dangerous cocktail. But David, you wanted to follow up on this conversation.
I just want to say one thing very, very quickly, which is that I think that Valerie's absolutely right to insist on this distinction between the police and the military. The police, and you see this in the increasingly violent and unhinged reaction that they've had to BLM protests, where it's become increasingly violent, where they've simply taken out in an almost spasmodic sense, attacking people. The military, by contrast, has been very professional, and it seems to me that, in fact, the military is the only, as it were, portion of the federal government, to use an American expression, of all the bureaucracies that Trump has not been able to corrupt. And this is quite striking. I would not have expected this. I mean, as someone who studies organizations for a living, I would have thought that there were actually routines and norms that were more solid. But he went through all the cabinet agencies. He put his own people there. Congress obviously did nothing, and maybe they even surreptitiously cheered him or tried to work out private deals. It happened with the so-called independent or autonomous regulatory agencies. It's happened in spades to the Justice Department. It's happened to the judiciary. And so it strikes me that one of the things which is really quite striking from a small r, Republican standpoint, is the massive and pervasive corruption, which is one of the reasons, I think, why so many O-line Republicans turned against him. It's one of the reasons why a lot of O-line lefties, like people like Chomsky, turned against him and so forth, in the sense that this is not just that this was, potentially fascist danger, but that this was destroying every single bit and piece of the kind of institutions that had been built up over in some cases, over more than a century. And it's striking that the military was the one thing that he was not able to touch. Now, if that's because he actually venerated it or pretended to, or because they simply insisted on going things by the book, or because, for example, it's just such an enormous organization. You have literally millions of people. It's much bigger than most other bureaucracies. I don't know why it is. But he never had in charge of the military someone like a Barr, okay? Someone who would deliberately corrupt, and I use the term deliberately, corrupt and destroy and instrumentalize all parts of the bureaucracy. That, I think, is both fascinating and repulsive at the same time, and it's worth noting, and I think it actually is one of the small reasons why he actually lost support. If you think about the mothers, for example, who were appalled at children being put in cages, which of course they should be appalled at children being put in cages, but the fact that there was actually cheerleading going on by people who were prosecutors and by people who were ICE officials and so forth, for a lot of people was even more shocking than that.
Thank you, David. We'll take a last question.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, Catherine. For you and your friends or people from your generation, what is the most important policy area that the next administration should tackle, hoping for a Biden win?
It's a hard question. I think I'm just one person. I think climate change is something that's on the forefront of my generation's mind far more than it is perhaps on other generations' minds, especially you look at the summer and the devastating wildfires that you had in California, also in Colorado, extreme weather events on the eastern seaboard. The window for action I think it can be argued, has passed. We're playing catch up here. I think that's a significant issue. I think about student debt and the fact that my generation has on average about 300% more debt than our parents' generation, the boomers. That's a significant issue. Hand in hand with that, the other big source of debt for Americans, particularly young Americans, is healthcare related debt. And the amount of people my age who are uninsured or underinsured, huge needs there, whether or not the Biden administration is able to accomplish any kind of substantial action on those fronts remains to be seen. Small action on healthcare like surprise billing, things like that, I think there could be bipartisan consensus there. But in terms of, again, it's realistically what can a Biden administration accomplish? And again, hoping, we just left the Paris Accords. Biden would bring us back into that, which is significant when you think about climate change. But it's always going to be, I think, a question of speaking pragmatically, what can Biden accomplish? And about the things that my generation cares about, I think it's a question.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It has been a fascinating conversation. I think we get more what are the challenges that the U.S. society and the U.S. in general is facing in the coming weeks, months, and years. And I would like to thank so much the panelists. Bernard Harcourt is the only panelist in the field, so to say, feeling the pulse of the street. And David Silman, Professor of International Relations here at the Graduate Institute, Catherine Puga, Master's candidate here at the Graduate Institute, Valerie Mims, former US government official, thank you so much. And I also thank the Club Diplomatique and the Graduate Institute, which put in place this panel discussion with Le Temps. So thank you so much, guys, and all the best, and have a good evening, good day, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Professor, I read your paper on stop and frisk.
Thank you all.